Hi, today I'm going to be taking you through a really quick demonstration of how to get data into DataRobot Data Prep and to also create a project that both imports many different formats and then also joins those formats. So let's get started. Plan to only be 5 minutes or so. First thing I'm going to do is just open up the New South Wales COVID-19 data. Now, this website has a number of different data sets. I'm going to look at, let's have a look at cases by location. And you can see here that there's an API. So DataRobot Data Prep has the ability to connect to various, let's increase the size of that, various REST endpoints. So what I'm going to do is just copy this endpoint and just make sure that I can get to it. And you can see that there's a JSON response, which is typical for most REST endpoints. What I'm going to do here is actually say, well, there are likely multiple different data sets that are available on this website. And so what I'm going to do is assume that each of the data sets are going to sit behind something with this root URL. So what I'm going to go ahead and do first of all, before I create a project in DataRobot Data Prep, I'm going to go to the library and go to data sources. Data sources, I can define, if I have permission, data sources to any connection that I have the connector to. And we've got over 50 connectors, so it's very easy to configure most of the connectors. You do need to know a little bit of technical detail, of course. So this is typically reserved for somebody with a little bit more of a technical understanding. So here I'm going to New South Wales COVID data. I don't want any proxies, and that's auto-filled for some reason. But my base URL here is this. And then you can set up multiple resources here. So if I had multiple endpoints that I wanted to set up, I could do that here. Now I'm going to just copy the rest of this string, and you'll recall that this data set was COVID-19 cases by location. So I'm going to go ahead and call it something similar, cases by location. And then I'm gonna name it that. So I'm gonna go ahead and say, well, let's test it just to make sure that it works. If the REST endpoint that you are importing needs authentication, then you can add that down here, of course. I can see this one doesn't, so it's connected successfully. So I save this. So I've got this New South Wales COVID data source here. So if I go back to my library, what I can do now is click on import. And importing data, I can choose to import from a local file, but I can also choose different data sources. So here I'm going to go and choose New South Wales COVID data. So that's my endpoint. And you'll see I only have one option here because, well, I only set up one endpoint. I'm going to click on it and I can see some parsing options here because it's detecting, well, we're getting a JSON response, and I can see that the response looks like this. And so this is a list of all of the different the COVID cases in Sydney across from 2020 till today. Cases by location is fine. Actually, maybe I'll call it something different. I'll call it New South Wales COVID cases by location. I'm going to finish it. I'm going to bring it in, and I'm going to create a project from it. Now, the other thing that I'm going to really quickly just explain is that this was a real world scenario where we needed to use this data. So let's COVID demo. So I'm going to create the project so I can start making manipulations on this data or to this data. It's going to spin up a pipeline for my data prep activities, and I can show you how to do certain things in here, but we'll keep that to a minimum to keep the duration of this demo nice and short. there are a couple of things that I want to do before I bring in the next data set. And there are two other data sets that I want to bring in. So the next one is going to be if I look here, I've got something called the SAFER, SEIFA, which is the, I guess, socioeconomic index of by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The file that I want is likely going to be, I believe it's this one, the state. And I can see that it's opened up down here, and I'm just going to have a look at this really quickly. I'm going to open it. I guess it doesn't really matter for the cases of this. Let's take the summary, actually. Let's take the SAFER summary. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually use this, and keep in mind there's multiple worksheets in this sheet, or in this Excel spreadsheet. So what I'm going to do is go back to DataRobot Data Prep. Before we actually go and join a data set, what I'm going to go ahead and do, just because I can see this date is not in a date format, and that just irks me, I'm just going to very quickly change that to a date format. I'm going to detect the date format. It's correctly detected it. I'm going to go ahead and save. And now I'm going to join in another data set. I'm actually going to use a lookup because the data that I'm using is going to be essentially a reference table. So I only want one match per row of data. And so I'm going to go ahead and import this data from my local machine. And from my local machine, I click upload. You can see there's an Excel spreadsheet, and remember there was that that first table that we were interested in. So you'll notice down here I have a number, well, once it uploads, I'll have a number of parsing options here, because what it's doing now is uploading the file and working out what format it is. It doesn't pay, DataRobot Data Prep doesn't pay any attention to the extension here. What it does is actually parses the first few, well, the start of the file, and then works out intelligently what that file format is. Of course, you can override it. So if, for example, it parsed it as something other than Excel, I could manually select Excel. But here, if it was a delimited file, I could do that. It's worked out that it's just not JSON or not Avro or XML or a SAS file, but that's how you would change it manually. Why I wanted to go in here to the parsing options, as you can see on the right-hand side, I have this summary contents sheet, which is not what I want. I want table 1. Not only that, but table 1 had a big header at the beginning. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, if I flick back to it, actually, I can see the first 6, well, actually 5 and 6 appear to be the column headers, and the first 4 rows I probably want to discard. Okay, so that's updated correctly, and I have the information that I'm interested in. Here I'm actually going to call it the SAFER Socioeconomic Index. So for some reason it didn't show the whole name, but I'm going to go ahead and select it. One of the really nice things here now is I can choose the foreign primary key relationship that these two data sets have. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is detect the joins between these two data sets. So I'm just going to wait for a moment, because what's happening now is DataRobot Data Prep is comparing all of the columns in dataset A and all of the columns in this SAFER, or the socioeconomic data, and it's picked up that the LGA code and the suburb code is the same. So LGA is local government area code, and so that would fit quite nicely. So it's 51%. That looks good. I wasn't expecting matches for everything, because obviously there's not COVID everywhere yet. So sorry, that's incredibly pessimistic. But so now I've got 2 data sets, and what you can see very clearly here is that the sources on the left-hand side, this column has become a little bit more interesting. So you can see on the left-hand side, I have all of the original data, and on the right-hand side, I can see the socioeconomic data for those areas. Now, the other thing that I wanted to show or share is importing a local file, but I also wanted to just show really quickly the fact that we changed this to a date means that we can look at it on a timeline, and so you can see there was a little bump in January, February in 2000 in New South Wales, an area of Australia, and more recently it's spiked, and hopefully things are coming down under control, and it certainly looks that way potentially if we're looking at, we are looking at full periods. So here you can do various things, and again, this is beyond the scope of this demonstration, but I can zoom into specific areas within the graph. I can select various sections if I only want the more frequently occurring ones, or maybe I want, I don't know, these 3 buckets. I can do that here. I don't have to use this. I can also look at things like day of week, so maybe that's interesting, but certainly not in this use case, but you can see the distribution of the days of weeks for the things that I've selected. I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I am going to join in one last reference data set just to show you the process yet again for importing a local file. So here I've selected, or I'm going to select upload a local file, and you can see that's my safer stuff. I think I have it on my desktop. Yeah, Australian postcodes. So that's in an XML file, and I'm going to import it. Now we have very good parsing, as you've seen with the JSON response. Obviously JSON can be quite complex for business users to use, but we format it in a nicely formatted way. Same with XML. You can see here I've got the ID, postcode, etc., and just some of the Latin long locations, which may be interesting for modeling purposes later. So I'm going to go ahead and finish that. And once that finishes, I'm going to join it in. I'm just going to select it. And it's going to do the same thing. Well, I'm going to take the same approach. I could manually select the foreign primary key, but now what it's doing is actually looking across the 2 data sets that I have in the project, and it's looking at all of the data from dataset A, from dataset B, all of the columns, and then looking at this dataset C, which has an ID. Yeah, in this case, I know that Asquith is in the LGA of Hornsby. So I am going to go and override this, even though there is a high correlation between these 2 columns. I think the ID might be based on postcode, but I want to override it just in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. And you can see I'm building out this data set that, will be useful for me to potentially model the likelihood of future COVID cases potentially. I probably don't have enough data yet, but you can see the process of joining data sets and creating this training set in DataRobot Data Prep is a relatively easy process, and something that you can do very, very quickly and connect it to multiple different data sources. Any questions, please email me at callum.finlayson@datarobot.com. Thank you very much.